there we are. Thank you, everybody, and sorry for all the technical problems. So my name is Avishay Bar, and I'm working as a senior cloud security architect in Cyberark. And today we're going to talk about unit testing for Cloud Custodian policies, which is really a subject that we speculated a lot since we evaluated Cloud Custodian, and of course, other frameworks to apply cloud security policies across our organizations in scale. So just before we dive in, I wanted to give you a quick overview regarding our current cloud security challenges at Cyberark. Obviously, in a relatively growing organization such as Cyberark, we're facing some growth challenges. And since we shifted recently from a company that delivers software as a bundle to on-premise customers, obviously, to a SaaS company, we have a growing number of emerging teams and products and companies that was recently acquired. So each team and product requests, new cloud accounts and organizations or come up with their own, and we need to merge them in. So putting together a baseline is actually the first thing that we wanted to tackle. We currently have about 1,000 accounts, thousands of cloud accounts of all providers that are being used by hundreds of developers and development teams. And they're relatively free to do whatever they need in order to apply the business to grow. So obviously, we still have to be compliant with different regulations. So that also affects our security baseline. Just one thing that is important to note, we're a security company, so we defined a strict baseline to follow. And as part of this process, we see dozens of misconfigurations that are created every day. So thanks for everyone that is working on the Cloud Custodian project. So first of all, we designed the relevant policy. And I wanted to give you a glimpse on how the design process looks. So for our use case, we'll talk about a simple policy that actually ensures that S3 buckets are not publicly accessible. And if there are, we're using event-driven architecture to make sure that, that they're remediated. Obviously, unless they are specifically excluded by a resource tag. So we have the CloudTrail event that triggers once the S3 put public access block AWS API is called. You can see it here. And once the event occurs, we'll read the bucket configuration from the CloudTrail event. And then if the configuration actually permits the bucket to be public in any case, the rule will be not activated. But if not, we'll remediate the bucket and restore it to the secure configuration. And obviously, we will send an email to the owner to make sure that he is aware of the change. We also monitor additional API requests, such as S3 create bucket for bucket creation events, and put bucket tagging or delete bucket tagging in order to see if the exclusion that we defined is still intact, or we could resume the remediation process on a bucket that was defined to be excluded in the past. Obviously, also exclusion are being monitored by a relevant rule on our CSPM side to make sure that we're not abusing the exclusion mechanism. So for identifying test cases, after we understood the use case for our policy, we usually wanted to perform some basic test cases on each of our policies. So the first one is positive testing. Simple. We want to make sure that we provide valid input to the policy and see if it behaves as expected, right? The second one is negative testing. We provide invalid input to a policy, oppositely from positive testing, and we want to verify that the policy handles the incorrect input and it fails safely, and the resources are not impacted by that input. And exclusions. We also want to test our exclusions and make sure that we allow excluding resources by resource tags. And we want to test it from all directions to make sure that the development teams will not have unexpected behavior from the policies and the exclusions. We usually start with these three scenarios, and over time, we collect the relevant data from the teams and the logs to enhance the test and to get a better coverage. So nightly testing, we're also running those to make sure that we're fine and we handle uncaught errors during the usual testing period. So Cloud Custodian version upgrades, Boto3 version upgrades, and AWS APIs, which are announced, documented, or unannounced. So back to our use case, let's take a look on our policy that we defined earlier in our design. So I'm sure that you're all aware with this simple policy. We have a policy that blocks bucket public access, and we're checking for the existence of any property in the bucket configuration that may allow that. In parallel, we are checking if the allow public tag was specified, and if the conditions are met, we'll block the public accessibility of the bucket. And if the tag exists, we will not block it. So that's actually what we want to test. So we have two pillars. We have the filters that we want to test to make sure that we provided the correct filters. And we want to make sure that we have the correct action and that is working properly on our resource. So for our testing method, we'll be using the popular testing framework PyTest, which we'll call the modal library for mocking Boto3 calls. So just for those of you which are not familiar with Moto, it actually provides a convenient decorator that you can use in your testing methods. This is the mock S3 decorator. And instead of testing our policy against the real AWS environment, which will require internet connection, credentials, and all the relevant dependencies, we'll test our code against a mock AWS environment. And while it won't replace testing against a real environment, it provides a reliable enough backend for running unit tests and discover policy bugs. Obviously, not all Boto3 methods are covered in Moto, but at least for our use case, they fit. But anyway, methods that Moto doesn't cover, you can monkey patch them and cover them as well. So now we have a demo, and let's hope that we'll not have any technical difficulties in the demo, and the god of demos will be on my side this time. So in this demo, we're going to write a test, and I'm going to make a few assumptions. This is the technical side. You need to be comfortable with Python in a basic level, things like classes, inheritance, functions, decorators, etc. You also need to be familiar with the AWS SDK for Python, Boto3. And let's roll out the demo. So we're going to create an S3 bucket with insecure configuration, run the policy, and then see the results after the policy run. So just let me switch to my Visual Studio Code for the demo. All right. Hope you can see it all. Okay. I prepared our test file with our basic class, the S3 policy test, that it inherits from the custodian policy test. And this class actually contains some methods and some code that will allow us to run a policy with the configuration that fits our testing use case without writing the same code again and again. So code reuse. If you're interested, I have the repository ready in the end of the session. So now we have our base class, and now it's time to define the testing methods. So since we want to test, the bucket configuration with public access block disabled, let's call it in the same way. So test S3 with public block disabled. So I have my snippets ready up front. And here it is. And like before, we are going to override some Cloud Custodian methods. So we're going to override the write file method and the dumps util methods of the Cloud Custodian, because we don't want them to do what they intend to. Instead of output files with the relevant resources that were changed by Cloud Custodian, we want to save them into a variable. So we could analyze them later on using the PyTest methods like assert equal. So now it's the time to define the test logic. So first we need to instantiate our Boto3 client. So this is our Boto3 client, and the Boto3 client is actually automatically mocked by the mock S3 decorator that we defined earlier on. And then we'll want to call list bucket just to make sure that our mocked backend contains no buckets to work on, so we have a clean state. So this is our first test, actually making sure that our environment is ready and clean. So let's run this simple test. All right, so we can see that the test runs fine. And we're good to go for the next step. So the next step is actually creating a test public bucket by calling, the respectable bot of 3 calls. So let's do it. So we're creating a bucket, and then we're putting a access block configuration, public access block configuration, which is insecure, obviously. So that's great. And the next step will be actually running Cloud Custodian. So we're running Cloud Custodian programmatically by Python by the run policy method, which we wrapped in our own custom code. And we're choosing the policy path, which is going to be policy s3.yaml, and the policy name, which we name s3 public block enable all. So let's run our test and make sure that everything goes through. All right, so we're still green. So that's great. Now we need to define what would a good configuration would look like, right? So let's define the JSON configuration that we expect to get, and then compare it with the bucket configuration that we're getting from both of 3. So let's do it. So here we are. We have the S3 public access block after policy run, which calls the both of 3 method. And we have our expected public access block configuration, which is what we expect to get after the policy has run. So now the final step will be to examine our test results. So we're going to assert 2 things. One thing is that we have one bucket that violated the policy, right? So we have our bucket, and it violated our policy. And we want to make sure that custodian resources caught one resource. So that's our first assert equal. And the second one is actually examining the properties of the bucket itself after the policy had been run, and make sure that they're equal to what we expect. So let's do it. Awesome. So after the policy had run and we see that all of our tests went through, that means that our policy is well covered. Now we can go and test further scenarios, like testing what happens when we specify our exclusion tags, or any other edge case or other use case that comes to our mind. So with optimism in mind, let me switch back to my presentation. Yeah, so that concludes the demo and also the presentation. I just wanted to give a huge shout out to Zach Scholl from the Zendesk at the time for the inspiration for this testing method that we took and we enhanced. And I encourage you all to visit the example GitHub repository where you can find more tests for popular policies. And it's also a great starting point for writing your own testing infrastructure and enhancing your policy's stability. So if you have any questions, I'd be more happy to help. You can reach me on LinkedIn, Twitter, Cloud Custodian, Slack, or GitHub if you found any issues with the code. Thank you very much. Umar, do we have some time for questions?
Thank you so much, Avishay. We can take one question if there's any. Did we miss any, George, out? Anything specific? I think people were asking
in chat. I don't see one yet. Hold on.
I think folks were asking links, and Kapil did provide those already.
Mm-hmm.
So let me just check the state as well.
AJ says thank you.
Your repo, Avishay, I think.
Yeah, so I'll provide the link in the chat or in the Q&A and in the Cloud Custodian
Bill's got it.
Slack
Thank you, Bill.
channel. No problem. Yep.
Bill's got it. Thank you, Bill. And I think